Hello, and welcome to the second of our three-part series on Blessed John Henry Newman, Firmly I Believe. I'm James McCullough, and I'm speaking to Father Guy Nichols in the library of the Birmingham Oratory. So he was sent to Maryvale, to Birmingham.
Yes.
Why Birmingham? Why was this chosen?
It was largely to do with Pope Pius IX.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this, he must have taken some account of the fact that Wiseman was in Birmingham.
Okay.
Newman certainly always regarded it as being a direct sign of God's will, that the papal brief that established the Oratory in England, and Newman as the one to bring it here under papal direction, specifically named Birmingham as the sphere of operation. And I think that Newman always felt that had it not been for that, he might well not have felt that he had to fix his life here. There were times when he was being tempted to move elsewhere, not so much within himself as by other people who said, you should be in a greater sphere of action, in an important place. And Newman himself said, for instance, London is a centre, Oxford is a centre, Brummagem, to give it its colloquial name,
yes,
which he did, is no centre.
Right.
And in those days, in the middle of the 19th century, that was probably more true than it is now.
Right.
And I think therefore, people felt, well, he's just being lost in this rather, dingy part of the world, which is mainly just, it's commerce and it's industry. These things have got nothing to do with Newman's gifts. Newman disagreed. Not only did he think, no, I've been sent here by the Pope as a sign of God's will, and because Bishop Wiseman, of course, was there at the time, although he eventually, as you know, moved off to Westminster as the first Cardinal Archbishop, but he also thought, and this is something he said specifically on one occasion, in the 1860s, when he was invited by another ex-Tractarian convert, who was by now living in Rome, Monsignor George Talbot, said, come to Rome. I'd very much like you to come and preach. And we've got a wonderful, class of people here in Rome who would love to hear you preach and who would appreciate you so much more than you've got the possibilities of back in England. And Newman replied rather frostily, perhaps you might say, well, I have no taste for the kind of work you have designed for me here, and I have to say also, you must remember this, Birmingham people have souls too.
Yes, lest we forget.
Yes, quite.
But of course, Birmingham was a centre, or not a centre, but it was an area of growing Catholic population.
Yes.
And the demographics of that time in this place. Irish immigrants coming in to feed the Industrial Revolution and the growth of the industry in Birmingham. So maybe this ties in with Newman's mission for the poor.
I think it does. And I think that that's precisely why he realised that's what he was being called to. Not that he hadn't had previous experience. Because one of the things that you have to remember is that Newman didn't just simply take on this idea of being a priest in a poor area from coming to Birmingham and thinking, oh, well, here I am, I better do something about it. He had been ordained as an Anglican clergyman back in the 1820s, and while he was still, of course, a don in Oxford. And he didn't just sit in his room in Oxford reading books or going out and lecturing to students. He spent enormous amounts of time and effort in the parish to which he was appointed a curate.
Yes.
St Clements, which was the poorest section of Oxford, where the poorest of the population lived, and over Magdalen Bridge, so outside of the posh parts of Oxford altogether.
Yes.
And he did a tremendous amount of work. He visited everybody. He cared for the sick. He gave financial assistance to people who were in great need. He also set up a Sunday school. It's one of the very important parts. Of course, education for him wasn't just about dealing with the bright. Right. He also dealt with ordinary people who had no letters, no learning. He wanted to make sure they had an opportunity too to know their faith and to be able to practice it all the better for it. So as an Anglican clergyman, he was dealing very, very closely with the poor.
And Littlemore as well, which I believe came under St Clements and
No. Littlemore came under St Mary's.
Ah, right, St Mary's.
Yes. So this is a next phase. See, one of the things that happened was when he took over the care of St Mary's from the man who became the provost of Oriel, at this time Edward Hawkins. And the relationship between Oriel and St Mary's was always a close one. Right from the foundation of the college, it had been the case that the rector of St Mary's was a fellow, well, the vicar of St Mary's rather, was a fellow of Oriel. So this just continued right through into Newman's time and beyond. So Newman took over from Hawkins when Hawkins became the provost of Oriel, the head of the college, and could no longer, of course, function as the vicar of St Mary's. And that's when, of course, Newman started this wonderful series of lectures, which, of course, is largely associated with his university work. But they're not actually that. There was a series of university sermons, a very important series. But that's actually quite separate from the 8 volumes of parochial and plain sermons.
Right.
And, of course, although we think of them in terms of the influence they had on many of the students who were to become Tractarians and future Catholics, they weren't exclusively designed for the students. They were also designed for the parishioners of St Mary's.
Yes.
And as you quite rightly say, the reason why he became associated with Littlemore was precisely because Littlemore was part of St Mary's parish. It seems strange because it's a long way out. And you actually have to pass another Anglican parish, an ancient one, Iffley, in order to get there.
I see.
But nonetheless, it was part of the parish and had, as he knew when he took over the care of St Mary's, it had long been neglected. And he realised that here was another sphere of duty that he ought to work in, not just that he wanted to, but he realised there was a duty that was laid upon him.
A rural agricultural
Very much
parish
so.
in those days.
That's
so
right.
He set up a school there.
He set up a school there as well.
Yep.
And he taught in it himself because he realised very quickly that the schoolmaster was not much use.
Right.
So in typical way of him, he just rolled up his sleeves and did the job himself. And at the same time, of course, he was looking after their needs. He built a church for them. Of course, one of the other aspects of Littlemore being in the parish was that they had no church.
Yes.
Because they were expected to go to the parish church. Right. But that was, 2-3 miles away in Oxford? Because it's quite a long way.
By foot, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, of course, obviously very few of them ever did. So as far as he was concerned, here was, as you say, a community of agricultural labourers, not an elite group at all. And they needed the services of religion and teaching in the faith. So he provided them with a church and a school.
Right.
And he, of course, was he was largely responsible for every aspect of both. So the church itself was designed according to his own specifications. And he preached a wonderful series of sermons in that church on the symbolism of church buildings. It was part of the way in which he was gradually beginning to develop a sense of sacramentality, of the idea of the visible world being an image of and a kind of a conveyor of the realities, the hidden realities of the invisible world.
So we see this part of his mission to the poor, quite early on in his career.
Yes.
So now let's talk about the establishment, though, of the oratory here in
Yes.
Edgbaston. How did it come about, the building of this amazing structure?
It was always envisaged that the oratory would have a proper permanent home.
Yes.
When the oratory was given the care of what would become St Anne's in Ulster Street, Derrit End, it wasn't envisaged that would be their permanent home, but they were given the care of the mission, which just needed a priest to care for them. Well, not just a priest, but a community, of course, they had. In order to provide for the needs at that time when the whole ecclesiastical structure of Birmingham was still very new.
Yes.
It was in 1850, for instance, while they were at Derrit End, that the hierarchy was re-established.
Right.
And it was at that point, of course, that Bishop Wiseman was moved to Westminster. to become the first cardinal and archbishop. So Wiseman's connection with Birmingham ceased in that year, 1850. So that was the time they were at Derrit. And the new bishop who came in, who was to remain a lifelong friend of Newman's, was the Yorkshire Benedictine monk, William Bernard Ullathorne. And Bishop Ullathorne was indeed to be an extremely energetic pastor, the first Catholic bishop of Birmingham. And I think that the friendship that they struck up very quickly was an enormous assistance to deciding how Newman would fit in with how the Oratory as a whole would fit in with what Birmingham needed in the way of of church provision.
So I'm assuming that the bishop was from one of those large Benedictine monasteries in Yorkshire, and so they're very good at administration and organisation.
Yes.
And, making
actually,
things happen.
Although he was a Yorkshireman by birth,
right.
he didn't. Of course, there weren't any of those big monasteries like that came in later. He was actually technically a monk of Downside. And he had also he'd had a very extraordinary life. I know this isn't strictly speaking part of the Newman story, but it's a fascinating thing. He'd actually, as a young man, he'd run away from home and he'd gone to sea because he'd had this tremendous idea that he wanted to travel the world and be a seafarer. So he did. And then he eventually came back and he decided he got a calling to be a monk. But he also, having had experience of travel, he also realised that there were things that he felt called to do beyond the reach of England. And so he went to the Oceania.
Okay, yes.
There was a big English mission out in New South Wales. Right. There's still quite a lot of evidence of it. Quite a few Benedictine bishop monks who were buried out there in Sydney. And he went to be one of the youngest bishops of the time. He was out there in Oceania, and he was quite signally important in bringing about a reform of the whole of the penal system. He wrote a very important report for a royal commission that was held, I think it was in the 1830s, when he was still a very young man too. And that was responsible for bringing to public attention some of the horrors of what was going on through the whole transportation system. And it brought a lot of that to an end. So then he eventually came back to England as a vicar apostolic, and then of course was translated to Birmingham as the first bishop in 1850, the first bishop of the see, when the see was established. Right. So he'd had a lot of experience, and a very different kind of experience. And he was also one of those whom Newman not only admired, but also recognised that here was somebody who'd been brought up as a Catholic. He wasn't a convert like himself and his friends. But here was someone who he thought would have benefited hugely from the kind of broad education that he himself had enjoyed, not just at school but at university. And thought, that's the sort of thing that I ought to be doing, is I ought to be helping to provide the kind of education that has not been available to Catholics in this country for hundreds of years. Right. And that again links in with Pius IX, because the bishops in Ireland at this point, and in conjunction with Pope Pius IX, decided that they wanted to set up a Catholic university.
Yes. Because
it was around the time that Sir Robert Peel, as the Prime Minister in the 1830s, wanted to establish university colleges in Ireland to extend the range of education to the poor. At that time, there was only one educational institute of a tertiary kind in Ireland. That was Trinity College, Dublin.
Right, yes.
And of course, that was very small. And like Oxford and Cambridge, of course, it was totally Anglican. So, of course, it catered for a vanishingly small part of the population.
Right, yes.
So one of the things that Peel wanted to do was to establish Queen's colleges, as he called them, in various cities or towns around Ireland to cater for the local population. But they would be non-denominational. That was part of Peel's aim, you see. So by that it meant, of course, non-Anglican, but also non-anything else.
Yeah, yeah.
The bishops, of course, of Ireland were extremely concerned about this. That, well, this is what we would call indifferentism. The idea any old religion will do here. Well, they're not going to teach the Catholic religion. We need to do something about this. So they got together, and with Pope Pius IX, they said we need to found a university level of education, so that we can provide for our people what's otherwise they're going to be leaking off into these other colleges to find.
Indeed,
if they can.
indeed.
So if they wanted to be trained up as doctors or lawyers, they would be going to these other colleges. So, no, we'll bring them here to a Catholic university. So that's when the approach was made to Newman. Said, well, here's a man who's got all the experience of running a university, or being in a university. Maybe he's the right person to found and run one for us. So Newman took on this, again seeing in the request of Pope Pius IX and the Irish bishops a divine commission, that he was to use all of his gifts, and he'd always seen the importance of education for the Catholic communities. So he thought, well, this would be a great thing to do, because it could be an international Catholic university for the English-speaking world.
Right.
So Ireland, of course, is naturally a very Catholic country in
Indeed.
Population.
Yes.
Although, of course, in establishment, obviously not, as you know, of course. So here would be a perfect opportunity to found a university with a Catholic population, because you need a kind of critical mass to make a big educational idea work, as he understood, which is why, of course, Oxford and Cambridge worked in England, because you'd got, obviously, a naturally Protestant Anglican population of the educated anyway, who would then naturally feed into the universities. So he wanted to see the same kind of thing provided for the Catholics, but not just for Ireland, but also for English Catholics and for American Catholics, and any other Catholics who were English speaking, if they were, because I think probably Australia was a bit too far away in those days, but nonetheless the idea was an English speaking Catholic university.
Yes.
In the centre of population, which was strongly Catholic already.
Yes.
So that was how University College, as it eventually became, of course, was established. So
Yes.
the Catholic University of Ireland.
So to re-establish Ireland as the land of saints of scholars.
Absolutely.
So he was
Yes.
rector there?
He was indeed,
Yes.
and remained so for about 6 years. And during that period of time, and this is a very important thing to remember, he remained thoroughly devoted to his oratory as well. So he had to do something extremely difficult, and not entirely successfully, which was divide his time between England and Ireland. So he was travelling back and forth between Birmingham and Dublin many times. I can't remember the exact number of times, but it's something phenomenal. And of course, as you know, in the 1850s, travel between England and Ireland was not like getting on a plane.
No, it's a steamship across the Irish Sea.
Yes, and the railway, which was, of course, by then was new.
Right.
But even so, a fairly tedious journey, winding through the Snowdonia to get to Holyhead.
That couldn't have been easy to divide that amount of travelling time between these two places and to establish two new institutions.
Yes, precisely. So he relied on particularly on having good deputies here at the Oratory. So again, that's where Father Edward Caswell was so important.
I see, yes.
Because Father Edward really took on a role as his deputy here for the Oratory itself. And he had to find other priests, and that was difficult actually, to do the same thing in Ireland, because it was more difficult for him to find people who were acceptable both to himself and to the Irish bishops. Moreover, the Irish bishops were fighting among themselves.
Right. And there was a problem with the Irish bishops, I believe. He fell out after he wrote that handbook of how to run a university. You'll be able to correctly phrase it for me.
Well, yes, it wasn't so much of the idea of the university as his collected addresses to the university became gathered together and published as. It was to do really with the policies that he pursued. And this is where a very important difference of view came to be clearly seen between himself and Archbishop Cullen, the Archbishop of Dublin. What Cullen wanted, really, and had wanted right from the very beginning, was a kind of seminary.
Right.
And his whole idea was that you would get people together into this, give them a good education, and then perhaps hope that most of them would become priests. This, of course, was all a male institution anyway. You might also get some useful people like medics and lawyers as well, but the main thing be a priest. But whichever way around you look at it, what he wanted was an institution that was very kind of self-contained, very protected from the outside world. Therein lay the difference with Newman, because what Newman said was needed was the kind of institution in which young men could be given a very sound education, but they could be exposed to all the difficulties in the world while under guidance and protection.
Yes.
So Newman wanted the possibility of them being able to go into the world, to be exposed to some of the ideas that were actually quite toxic, so that they would be given the opportunity also to find what's the antidote to this. What have you got to watch out for in the world and be on your guard against? So Newman saw these are the sorts of things that you can't escape simply by ignoring them.
Right.
Because the moment that you leave the institution where you've been kind of coddled and protected, you're then thrown upon a whole world of ideas and circumstances which you've not had any preparation for and you don't know how to deal with.
Exactly.
So Newman was very, very strong about this and thought this is absolutely essential to the whole idea of education as I understand it. And so on the basis of that, he and Cullen kind of drifted apart. There wasn't any specific moment of rupture per se, but Cullen was always trying to push one way, Newman was trying to push back another as far as possible and say, you know, this is what I think needs to be done. And then eventually, of course, also the pressure of trying to keep the oratory going here as well.
Yeah, yeah.
He realised it was all just too much. I don't know how on earth he managed it. And all this, of course, took place after only just after he'd endured the terrible stress of the Achilli trial.
Yes. Tell us briefly about this terrible thing. Yeah.
Well, this was again all that came out of the restoration of the hierarchy in 1850. There was a great explosion of righteous indignation on the part of
anti-Catholic sort of.
Yes,
Yep.
and it looked as though we were going to get the Gordon riots all over again, you know, and of course that was horrendous. So a lot of people were actually quite frightened. A lot of Catholics were very concerned and thought, well, maybe we've taken this far too far. We shouldn't be doing this. Maybe we should just stayed quiet and not poked the lion in the cage. Newman didn't take that view at all. He took a much more robust view and said, no, this is the right time to do what the Pope has done, because he reckoned that the Pope was wise to have taken the view that now the Catholic Church in England needed to start to recoup some of its strength and its position in public society. So he wrote a series of very important lectures which he delivered here in Birmingham, called On the Present Position of Catholics in England.
Yes.
And it was a series of lectures, one of which he took the opportunity to take a swipe at a very significant figure who was being, at that time, paraded around the country in the form of an Italian ex-priest called Giacinto Achilli. And this man Achilli was going around saying, I'm a victim of the Roman Inquisition. You see me before you as one who's escaped from the snare of Romanism. I've been persecuted by the Catholic Church, and here I am among you as a propagator of the truth of Protestantism. So of course he was lauded by all the Protestants around and helped to provoke a lot of trouble, because the famous Murphy riots, which took place in 1850, were largely a reaction by Irish Catholics to the kind of provocation that was provided by the Protestants as a result of Achilli. So Newman happened to know from Cardinal Wiseman, because Wiseman had spent so many years in Italy, that this man Achilli, who'd been a Dominican, was in fact a convicted rapist.
A serial rapist.
Serial rapist. Yes,
Yes.
indeed, he was an abuser,
Yes.
as we would recognise now,
Yeah.
of the most horrendous kind, such, you know, as we're alas all too familiar with now. And this, of course, had not been taken note of back here in England. If anybody knew about it in the Protestant side, they were keeping quiet. Achilli himself, of course, didn't allude to any of this. But Wiseman knew it. Newman picked this up from Wiseman and said, I think we've got to do something about this. Do you know all the details about it? Wiseman said, yes, it's fine. He took Newman took advice from some of his lawyer friends. Should I publish? Will it be all right? Said, well, you would be technically liable to do it, but given the fact that that Achilli is a known convicted serial abuser, he's not going to defend himself for fear of what can be coming out. But they miscalculated, because the moment the Protestant truth people said, prosecute,
Yes.
get a libel action, and then of course they tried to get it done quickly so as to get Newman convicted before he'd had time to pick all his witnesses, because dear old Cardinal Wiseman had lost all his papers.
Yes.
And so couldn't provide the written evidence. So Newman had to send Father Ambrose, again, you see, dear old Ambrose, ever the faithful friend. Ambrose went at a moment's notice and picked up all these people from central Italy who'd all been victims of Achilles' misdeeds, brought them at great expense and trouble back to England. He had to persuade them to come back and give witness in an English court. It wasn't an easy thing to do.
True.
The moment that the Achilles side knew this was happening, knew that they'd got witnesses coming against him, they tried to have the whole trial postponed so as to make it more difficult to keep the people there.
Yes, I see.
So eventually it came to trial rather later. They had just about managed to keep everyone together at some expense as witnesses. And so the case was heard. But as you know, because the trial was so heavily weighted against Newman, I mean, the trial judge, Coleridge, was a furiously anti-Catholic figure. So he was desperate. He directed the jury to find Newman guilty.
Yep.
And then took the opportunity to give him a severe dressing down.
Yes, and fined £100. Yes. But there was an interesting twist to this, where Coleridge's, the judge's son, turned out to be the poet.
Yes, and a Catholic.
And a Catholic, exactly,
Catholic
converted
convert.
to, yes.
That, of course, is one of the most beautiful ironies in the whole
isn't it?
story.
Indeed.
The Coleridges, in fact, became great friends of the cardinals thereafter.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, and so that's one of the beautiful outcomes of that particular story. Yes.